Mrs. Lurd came through the gate at 2 in the afternoon. She was carrying a cloth bag on each shoulder and a smaller bag in her right hand. The way she always traveled, distributed evenly, nothing dragging, prepared for a longer walk than the one she actually had to take. She was wearing her good blouse, the lime green one with the flower brooch. She had dressed for arriving somewhere, not for the mud that was currently covering approximately 40% of her son's face. Jack saw her first. He was knee-deep in the eastern drainage channel, both hands on a spade, a streak of red clay drying on his left cheekbone, his glasses somehow still on his face, despite everything. He looked up, and she was there, standing at the gate, looking at the farm. He did not speak. She did not speak. She took in the scene the way she took in most things completely, without showing what she was calculating. The blue plastic sheeting still stretched across the open veranda frame, the churned earth of the drainage channels running east from the garden, the tools laid out in the mud. Tu Tien on her knees 30 meters away, packing a section of channel wall with flat stones, her hoodie the color of wet concrete. Back Dung standing at the far end with a tamper, also mud-covered, also not yet aware of the arrival. Then Mrs. Lur looked at her son. "You're 2 days early," Jack said. "Yes," she said. "You didn't call." "No." She walked through the gate. She did not go to the house. Jack had expected her to go to the house to set her bags down, to look at the progress on the walls, to find the kitchen and assess whether the stove had been used properly. This was what his mother did when she arrived somewhere. She assessed. Instead, she walked across the muddy yard, past the tools, past Tu Tien, who had stopped working and was watching with her mouth slightly open, past the section of stone path that was still unfinished. And she went directly to the eastern corner of the garden, to the frangipani tree. Jack set down his spade. He did not follow immediately. He stood in the drainage channel, with mud to his knees, and watched his mother walk to the tree he had straightened 2 days ago in the rain. Tu Tien appeared at his elbow. She had not made a sound getting there. "Does she know?" Tu Tien said quietly. "I don't know what she knows," Jack said. They watched. Mrs. Lurd crouched in front of the tree. She was still wearing her good blouse. She did not seem to notice or care about the mud she was crouching over. She looked at the base of the tree for a long moment, at the fresh soil packed around the roots, at the slight discoloration where new earth met old, at the way the ground had been tamped down in the particular pattern of 2 hands pressing with the heel of the palm. She put her own hand flat against the soil. She kept it there. Jack understood then that she was not reading the tree. She was reading the hands that had fixed it, the shape of the pressure, the depth of the pack, the care that had gone into something she could not have asked for because she had not been there to ask. She stayed crouched for a long time. Neither Jack nor Tu Tien moved. Behind them, at the far end of the drainage channel, Bac Dung had gone very still. He had seen her now. He was standing with the tamper in both hands, watching, and he had not moved in what felt like a long time. Mrs. Lurd stood up. She brushed her hand on her thigh, a practical motion, the kind that comes after you have touched something and are satisfied with what you found. She looked at the tree one more time, then she turned around and walked back toward the yard. Jack climbed out of the drainage channel. His boots were solid with mud. He pulled them off at the edge of the channel and walked toward her in socked feet, which immediately became mud-socked feet, which he decided was the least of his problems. "Mom, the drainage runs east," she said. She was looking at the channels now, not at him. "Yes, 3 meters farther than planned. The storm showed us where the water wanted to go." "Good." She nodded once. "You should have done it that way from the start." "I know. The veranda sheet it held?" "It held." "The timber?" Dry? She nodded again. She looked at the farm, at the mud, at the channels, at the half-built walls that were somehow still standing and plumb, despite everything. She looked at the work the way someone looks at something they have been worried about from a distance and are relieved to find still standing. Then she set her bags down on the driest piece of ground she could find. She opened the smaller bag. She reached in and took out a wrapped package, flat, paper-wrapped, tied with a simple string. She held it out toward Tu Tien. Tu Tien had come up beside Jack without either of them noticing. Bon Phu Thay, Mrs. Ly said, from the shop near Aunt Than's house. The good one, not the market one. She pressed it into Tu Tien's hands. Then she looked at the tea things still on the veranda step from 2 days ago. Pham tramui di kom. Tra kun goi roi. Tu Tien looked at the package in her hands. She looked at Mrs. May. Tu Tien started. Go on, Mrs. Ly said, not unkindly. The way you say go on when the thing that needs to happen next is simple and the person in front of you is making it complicated by feeling too much about it. Tu Tien went. Jack stood with his mother in the mud. She was looking at the frangipani tree again from this distance. Her face was composed. Her hands were loose at her sides. The flower brooch on her blouse caught the afternoon light, the light that came back after rain in this part of the highlands, gold and clean and slightly too bright, the way things look when they've just been washed. How bad was it? She said. The tree was leaning 15 degrees. The roots were partially exposed, but you caught it. Bok Dung told me how to pack the base. I know how Bok Dung tells people things, his mother said. He tells them while already doing it. Jack almost smiled. Yes. A pause. The kind his mother used the way other people used sentences. I planted it in new soil, she said. I knew it was a risk. New soil doesn't hold in the first rain. You could have waited. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. But I wanted it in the ground. I wanted it to be there already when things happened. Not planted after. Jack looked at the tree. Small, straight. The fresh soil around its base, still a slightly different color from the earth around it. He understood what she meant. Some things need to be in the ground before the storm comes. Not because they will definitely survive, but because survival is not the only reason to plant something. Mom, he said. Yes. You could have called 2 days early. I know. She did not explain further. He looked at her. She was still looking at the tree. Were you worried? He asked. She turned her head slightly, not fully toward him. Just enough. I am always worried, she said. I have been worried since the day you were born, and I have not stopped once. Worrying is not the same as not trusting. Jack stood with that for a moment. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. From across the yard, Bok Dung walked toward them. He had cleaned his hands on a cloth, not completely, just enough. He was carrying the tamper loosely in one hand. He stopped about 4 meters away, the distance a man keeps when he is not sure what kind of moment he is walking into and wants to leave room for it to be whatever it needs to be. Chi Loi, he said, quietly, the form of address that belongs to people who have known each other for decades and have never needed to update it. Mrs. Lurd turned. She looked at him for a moment. Andung, she said, the same register. The same weight of years in 2 words. His ears went red, not gradually, not subtly. The specific redness that had appeared at the funeral, and at the gate when he watched her plant the tree, and at every moment in between, when something true surfaced faster than he could manage it. He looked at the tamper in his hand as if he had just noticed it was there. The eastern channels are well done, he said, to Jack, loudly. About drainage. Thank you, Bok, Jack said. Carefully, keeping his face where it was. Mrs. Lottie looked at Bak Dung for one more moment. Then she looked at the frangipani tree. Then she turned toward the veranda, where Tu Tien was already setting out cups, the kettle steam catching the afternoon light. "Come have tea," she said, to both of them, to neither of them in particular. She walked toward the veranda. Jack looked at Bak Dung. Bak Dung was looking at the frangipani tree. He stood there for a moment, this broad, mud-covered man, with his tamper and his red ears and 35 years of a thing he had decided was worth carrying. And then he set the tamper down against the garden wall and walked toward the veranda. Jack followed. The four of them sat on the veranda step. Fresh tea, bon fou they unwrapped in the center. The farm quiet around them in the returning afternoon light. The drainage channels newly cut, the frangipani tree standing straight, the plastic sheet over the unfinished veranda still holding. Mrs. Lurd poured for Bak Dung first. She did it without looking at him, without ceremony. The way you pour tea for someone when you have decided that the ceremony is not the point. His hand, taking the cup, was steady. Tu Tien caught Jack's eye across the tea things. Jack looked away first. He picked up a piece of bon fou thay and ate it, and looked at the farm and thought about what his mother had said. "I wanted it in the ground already when things happened, not planted after." He thought about a parking lot, a phone call, a woman who picked up on the second ring. He thought about the house behind them, walls standing, timber dry, drainage running east, built by hands that were not the same hands anymore and would keep changing. "The flooring starts next week," he said. "I know," Bak Dung said. "I sourced the sealant yesterday." "I know you know." "I'm saying it out loud." "Say it out loud then." "The flooring starts next week." Mrs. Lowe looked at her son. There was something in her face that was not quite a smile, and not quite not a smile. The expression of a woman who has spent 40 years watching the people she loves do things she already knew they would do. "Good," she said. She picked up her tea. The frangipani tree held its ground in the eastern corner of the garden, roots in new soil, straight in the afternoon light, doing what planted things do when they have been tended through the first storm.